April 25 H. Just before the early dawn, the sea itself was calm. But it remained, too. The kind of quiet that feels wrong when men know that they are about to die. As the first boats made their way towards the narrow beaches of the Gallipoli Peninsula, men held onto their rifles, greased with sweat. Some were not even in their early 20s. Quite a number had not experienced any combat. This, they had been informed, would be a brief affair. The enemy would collapse. Their navy, the best in the world, had done the hard work already. They were wrong. What occurred at Gallipoli would prove to be one of the worst disasters in the history of warfare in World War I. But it was to be far more. The disaster would reveal the hubris of the empire, forge a national identity, and, quietly and anonymously, lay the groundwork for the end of one world and beginning of another. This is the tale of what became of a war effort intended to end a war but which ultimately rewrote history. By the end of 1914, the First World War had already betrayed every promise made before it began. European leaders had predicted a short, decisive conflict. A few months of maneuver, a handful of battles, and victory would belong to the side with the strongest will. Instead, the war froze into something no one had prepared for. Across northern France and Belgium, millions of soldiers dug into trenches. Mud swallowed men whole. Machine guns erased entire regiments in minutes. Artillery thundered day and night, grinding landscapes into wastelands of wire, shell holes and broken bodies. The Western Front was locked. For Britain and France, the cost was terrifying. Casualty lists grew longer by the day, and there was no clear path forward. Attacking head-on meant slaughter. Standing still meant losing the initiative. And somewhere far to the east, another ally was beginning to crack. Russia, vast but under-industrialized, was bleeding. Cut off from reliable supply routes, its armies lacked ammunition, food, and modern equipment. Every setback on the Eastern Front raised the fear that Russia might collapse entirely, freeing German forces to focus west. The war needed a breakthrough. Something bold. Something unexpected. In London, the search for a solution began. On a map, the idea seemed almost elegant. The Dardanelles Strait was a narrow ribbon of water connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea. At its far end sat Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. If Allied ships could force their way through the strait, they could threaten the Ottoman heartland directly. The logic followed quickly. Knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. Open a sea route to Russia. Encourage neutral Balkan states to join the Allies. Outflank Germany without fighting through the trenches of France. It sounded like a shortcut to victory. The Ottoman Empire, after all, was widely dismissed in European circles. For decades, it had been labeled the sick man of Europe, a declining state plagued by internal unrest, outdated institutions, and military defeats. Recent losses in the Balkan Wars had only reinforced that image. Many British leaders believed the Ottomans would not withstand serious pressure. A strong naval demonstration near their capital, they assumed, might be enough to trigger collapse from within. This belief would prove fatal. Britain entered the war as the world's dominant naval power. Its fleet was not just a military tool but a symbol of global authority. For generations, British strategy had relied on ships to project force, control trade, and bend rivals to its will. Naval success had become habit. Blockades had won wars. Gunboats had subdued distant territories. Coastal bombardments had forced concessions from weaker states. The idea that the Navy could solve strategic problems was not fantasy. It was experience. But Gallipoli was not a colonial port. It was a fortified choke point defended by an empire fighting for survival. That distinction was blurred in London. Advocates of the plan argued that modern battleships could smash coastal forts, clear minefields, and sail straight through the straits. Once Allied ships appeared near Constantinople, they believed, the Ottoman government would panic. Warnings existed. Naval officers raised concerns about mines. Intelligence reports hinted at stronger defenses than expected. But these risks were framed as manageable, secondary to the potential reward. The gamble was accepted. What the Allies failed to grasp was how much the Ottoman Empire had changed. While European observers focused on Ottoman decline, reforms were quietly reshaping its army. German advisors had helped modernize training, artillery use, and defensive planning. The straits had been carefully fortified with layered minefields, mobile guns, and well-positioned infantry. Most importantly, this was not a distant battlefield for the Ottomans. Gallipoli guarded the gateway to their capital. Losing it would mean losing everything. Soldiers defending the peninsula were not fighting for prestige or alliances. They were fighting for home. Morale was higher than the Allies expected. Discipline was stronger. And leadership, as events would soon reveal, was far from incompetent. The Allies prepared for a brittle opponent. They were about to meet a determined one. The opening act of the campaign was meant to be decisive. On March 18,
Allied battleships advanced into the Dardanelles to force a breakthrough.
Massive guns thundered as shells slammed into Ottoman forts. Smoke rolled across the water. From a distance, it looked like overwhelming power in motion. But beneath the surface, the strait was waiting. Ottoman minefields, carefully laid and repositioned, turned the narrow waters into a deadly maze. Minesweepers, often crewed by civilians under fire, struggled to clear paths. As ships maneuvered to avoid artillery, they drifted into danger. By the end of the day, 3 Allied battleships were sunk. Several more were badly damaged.
The fleet withdrew.
The naval-only plan had failed. This was the moment for reassessment, the moment when boldness should have paused. Instead, the campaign escalated. With naval breakthrough impossible, Allied leaders shifted to a combined operation. Troops would land on the Gallipoli Peninsula, seize the high ground, and neutralize Ottoman defenses from land. The transition was rushed.
There was no unified command structure with clear authority.
Naval and army planners operated on parallel tracks. Intelligence about terrain was incomplete. Maps were inaccurate. Landing beaches were poorly understood. Yet optimism persisted. The belief remained that once soldiers were ashore, resistance would crumble. That momentum would compensate for preparation. That speed would overcome uncertainty. On April 25, 1915, the landings began. As the first waves approached the shore, many soldiers believed the hardest part was already behind them.
Instead, they stepped into chaos.
Boats landed at the wrong locations. Units became mixed and disoriented. Steep ridges loomed above narrow beaches. Ottoman fire erupted from concealed positions, cutting down men before they could advance inland. Within hours, defenders occupied the high ground. Among them was a relatively unknown Ottoman officer who understood the stakes immediately. He ordered his troops forward without waiting for higher approval, telling them there was no retreat. They would hold their positions or die where they stood. That decision would shape the entire campaign. By the end of the first day, the Allied advance had stalled. What was supposed to be a swift push inland became a desperate struggle just to survive. As days turned into weeks, Gallipoli revealed its true nature.
Water was scarce.
Heat was relentless. Disease spread rapidly through crowded camps. Supplies had to be carried up steep slopes under constant fire. Every attempted advance met entrenched resistance. Trenches appeared, carved into unforgiving rock and dust. The campaign that was meant to avoid trench warfare had recreated it in one of the worst possible environments. Yet still, leaders hesitated to withdraw. To leave Gallipoli would be to admit failure. To admit that assumptions about the enemy, about naval power, about empire itself, had been wrong. So the fighting continued. By mid-1915, the reality was undeniable. Victory was slipping away. Casualties mounted with no strategic gain. Soldiers on both sides endured months of suffering for meters of ground that changed nothing.
And yet, the campaign pressed on.
Why? Why did leaders continue a battle that no longer made sense? Why did they cling to a plan that had already proven flawed? The answers lie not just in military decisions, but in pride, politics, and the dangerous reluctance of empires to admit their limits. Gallipoli was no longer just a gamble. It had become something else entirely.
A mirror.
One that reflected the beginning of the end for an old world order. The Gallipoli Peninsula had become a place where time stood still by the time of summer 1915. Days passed undistinguished by the scorching Mediterranean sun.
The smell of dust, sweat, and death hung heavy in the air.
Flies were attracted to the laxity of latrine use, undisturbed corpses, and spoiled food. Water was rationed, and men dreamed of it at night. Disease proliferated at lightning speed. This was not the war the soldiers had been promised. Yet even so, the struggle from London, Paris, and Constantinople remained primarily on the maps and written reports. Some progress on the fronts. Numbers increased. Hope had merely been redescribed. This was the most perilous phase of Gallipoli.
Not the initial gamble,
but refusal to accept what the gamble had become. The geography of Gallipoli dominated everything. The terrain was a small, steep peninsula with ridges running parallel to the shoreline. Whoever occupied the high ground possessed all the control. The Ottomans occupied the ridges. Every Allied advance required soldiers to climb exposed slopes under fire. There were few natural paths inland, and those that existed were quickly turned into killing zones. Artillery support was limited by poor observation and supply difficulties. Naval guns, once seen as decisive, struggled to hit concealed positions. What the Allies faced was not just an enemy army, but terrain weaponized by defense. Modern military doctrine already understood this truth. Amphibious landings are fragile operations. Success depends on speed, surprise, and immediate seizure of high ground. Gallipoli achieved none of these. Once the initial landings failed, the campaign's strategic fate was effectively sealed. What followed was endurance warfare, not maneuver. On the Ottoman side, the campaign was transforming both the army and the nation. Defending Gallipoli was seen as a matter of survival. Soldiers were acutely aware that behind them lay Constantinople, the seat of government, culture, and faith. There was no depth to fall back into.
No second line.
This produced a different psychology. Ottoman units fought with the understanding that retreat meant national catastrophe. Orders were often simple and brutal: hold, counterattack, hold again. Casualties were enormous, but morale held. Leadership mattered deeply here. Junior and mid-level officers were forced to act independently, responding to landings and breakthroughs without waiting for centralized commands. Initiative, not rigid hierarchy, kept defenses intact during critical moments. This adaptability surprised the Allies, who had expected a slow, disorganized response. Instead, they met an army that learned quickly. While Ottoman command grew sharper under pressure, Allied command grew more confused. One of Gallipoli's most damaging flaws was the absence of a single, unified authority with clear strategic control. Naval commanders focused on sea operations. Army commanders focused on land battles. Political leaders intervened from afar, often with incomplete information. Decisions were made slowly. Opportunities slipped away. At times, local commanders requested permission to exploit small breakthroughs or withdraw from untenable positions. Responses took hours or days. By the time orders arrived, conditions had changed. This was not cowardice or incompetence at the individual level. It was systemic paralysis. An empire used to projecting power across the globe now struggled to coordinate its own forces on a narrow strip of land. As summer wore on, Gallipoli became a humanitarian nightmare. Medical facilities were overwhelmed.
Wounded men lay for days awaiting evacuation.
Many died of infection rather than their original injuries. Dysentery, typhoid, and heat exhaustion ravaged units already weakened by combat.
Flies infested wounds.
The stench of death clung to trenches.
Letters home grew darker.
Early optimism gave way to bitterness, confusion, and quiet despair. Soldiers wrote not of victory, but of endurance.
Of holding on. Of surviving another day.
On both sides, men shared the same misery. In some sectors, opposing trenches were so close that soldiers could hear one another talk at night. There were moments of informal ceasefires to collect the dead. Brief, fragile reminders of shared humanity in a landscape built to erase it. By August, Allied leadership faced a choice: withdraw and accept failure, or launch one final offensive to justify the sacrifice already made. They chose the latter. The August offensive was designed to break the stalemate by opening new fronts and capturing key ridges. Fresh troops were committed. New landings were planned. Optimism, once again, resurfaced in official statements, but the fundamental problems remained.
A terrain still favored the defender.
Our intelligence was still incomplete. Our coordination was still poor. Our Ottoman forces were now fully alert and entrenched. The offensive failed. Attacks bogged down almost immediately. Casualties soared. Gains were measured in yards, not miles. Ottoman counterattacks erased many of those gains within days. The last real chance for a decisive Allied victory at Gallipoli disappeared in the heat and blood of August. After the August failure, something changed. The language of optimism vanished from reports. Commanders stopped speaking of breakthroughs and began speaking of holding actions and containment. The campaign no longer aimed to win. It aimed to endure without collapsing. But endurance had a cost. Every additional week meant more dead, more wounded, more sickness. And still, leaders hesitated. Why was withdrawal so difficult? Because Gallipoli had become more than a battlefield. It had become a symbol. Leaving would confirm what many already feared: that imperial power no longer guaranteed success, that prestige could not replace preparation, that the enemy had been profoundly underestimated.
For empires, symbols matter.
And admitting failure threatens the illusion of control.
So the war dragged on.
Behind closed doors, the truth was sinking in. Military assessments acknowledged that Gallipoli could not achieve its original objectives. Political leaders began to consider evacuation, cautiously, privately, almost shamefully. The question was no longer how to win. It was how to leave without disaster. Ironically, the evacuation itself would become the most successful operation of the entire campaign. Carefully planned, meticulously executed, and carried out with minimal casualties, it demonstrated what Allied forces were capable of when clarity replaced denial. But that moment had not yet arrived. For now, Gallipoli remained a place where thousands waited, suffered, and died while decisions lagged behind reality. The campaign had stripped away illusions. What it would build in their place was still unknown. But far beyond the trenches, consequences were already taking shape. In the Ottoman ranks, a new sense of identity was forming. In the British Empire, confidence was cracking, and history was preparing to turn. By late autumn of 1915, at Gallipoli, the guns had not fallen silent. But something else had.
Belief.
The belief that this campaign could still be turned into victory had ebbed silently away, to be replaced by grim arithmetic. Every report from every angle now told the same story in different words. No breakthrough was possible, no strategic objective remained attainable, and every additional week on the peninsula meant irretrievable loss of life for nil gain. Gallipoli had failed. The question was no longer whether.
It was how to leave.
Withdrawal was the one word that the leaders had avoided since the first landings. To evacuate Gallipoli meant admitting that the original assumptions were wrong. It meant accepting that naval power could not simply force political collapse, that the Ottoman army had been underestimated, and that months of sacrifice had not brought the war any closer to resolution. For politicians, evacuation threatened careers. For generals, it threatened reputations. For empires, it threatened credibility. Yet by November 1915, the reality on the ground made denial impossible.
Winter was coming.
Storms swept across the peninsula, flooding trenches and collapsing dugouts. Men froze in soaked uniforms. Frostbite appeared alongside dysentery and typhoid. Supplies became harder to land. Artillery ammunition ran low. Even holding existing positions was becoming dangerous. What Gallipoli could not take by force, winter would take by indifference. Reluctantly, the decision was made.
The campaign would end.
Ironically, the evacuation of Gallipoli would become one of the most successful operations of the entire war. That success was born from necessity and humility. Commanders understood that a chaotic retreat would be catastrophic. Ottoman forces occupied the high ground. Any sign of withdrawal could trigger devastating attacks on exposed beaches. Thousands could be killed in a matter of hours. So planners did what they should have done at the beginning. They planned carefully. Evacuation would be gradual, silent, and deceptive. Troop numbers were reduced slowly. Equipment was removed at night. Dummy rifles were set up to fire intermittently using water drip mechanisms, creating the illusion of active trenches. Camps remained lit. Routine noises were maintained. The goal was simple: leave without the enemy noticing. It was a plan built not on confidence, but on caution. In December 1915, soldiers began slipping away from the peninsula under cover of darkness. There were no cheers,
no speeches, no sense of relief.
Men moved quietly, often carrying wounded comrades or personal belongings they refused to abandon. Some paused to look back at trenches where friends had died, where months of suffering had unfolded, where nothing tangible had been achieved. For many, the silence was heavier than the fighting. Against expectations, the evacuation succeeded. By January 1916, the last Allied troops were gone. Not a single life was lost during the final withdrawal. The irony was painful. The most dangerous operation of the campaign was the only one executed flawlessly. When the dust settled, the numbers told a brutal story. Hundreds of thousands of men had been killed, wounded, or incapacitated by disease on both sides. Entire units were shattered. Nations mourned lost generations. Families received letters that explained nothing and justified less. For the Allies, Gallipoli produced no strategic gain. The Ottoman Empire remained in the war. Russia remained isolated. The Western Front remained locked. The shortcut had led nowhere. But history rarely measures impact by immediate results alone. Gallipoli's true consequences were only beginning to unfold. In Britain, Gallipoli triggered a quiet but profound reckoning. Public confidence in leadership was shaken. Newspapers questioned decisions once taken on faith. Parliamentary inquiries examined how such a disaster had been allowed to happen.
Careers ended.
Political alliances fractured. The myth of effortless imperial superiority had been cracked. Gallipoli exposed weaknesses that could no longer be ignored. A poor coordination between civilian and military leadership. A over-reliance on prestige instead of preparation. And dangerous assumptions about non-European enemies. The empire had not lost its power. But it had lost something more subtle.
Certainty.
From this point forward, British strategy became more cautious, more methodical, and less willing to gamble on bold but poorly grounded ideas. The cost of Gallipoli lingered in every future decision. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became something else entirely. The campaign was their first major test on the world stage. Their soldiers had fought and suffered far from home, under foreign command, in a war that was not of their making. Losses were devastating. Yet from that tragedy emerged a powerful national memory. Gallipoli became a story of endurance, sacrifice, and identity. Not a victory, but a moment of self-definition. The idea that these young nations had proven themselves through suffering took root and would shape their cultures for generations. Gallipoli did not bring glory, but it brought meaning. For the Ottoman Empire, Gallipoli was both a victory and a paradox. The campaign proved that the empire could still defend itself against the world's strongest powers. It delayed collapse. It boosted morale. It unified a population that had long been divided by internal strains. But victory came at a terrible cost. Manpower was exhausted. Resources were drained. The empire survived Gallipoli, but it could not survive the war that followed. By 1918, defeat elsewhere would force its surrender.
Yet Gallipoli planted a seed.
The defense of the peninsula had elevated a new generation of leaders. Officers who had proven decisive, adaptable, and ruthless when necessary. Men who believed that survival required transformation. Out of the ruins of empire, a new vision began to take shape. When the First World War ended, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Its territories were carved up by victorious powers.
Old structures dissolved.
New borders were drawn with little regard for history or people. But the spirit forged at Gallipoli did not disappear. From that crucible emerged a modern nation-state, built on the rejection of imperial weakness and the determination never to be dismissed again. Gallipoli became not just a battle, but a founding memory. A reminder that survival was possible even against overwhelming odds. Gallipoli failed because empires believed their own myths. They believed power could replace preparation. They believed reputation could intimidate reality. They believed the enemy would collapse because history said it should. Gallipoli proved otherwise. It showed that modern war punished arrogance mercilessly. That nations fighting for survival could not be brushed aside. That strategic shortcuts often lead to dead ends. And it revealed something deeper. Empires do not fall only when they lose wars. They begin to fall when they stop questioning themselves. Gallipoli was not the end of an empire. But it was the moment the future stopped looking like the past. In the quiet after evacuation, as the sea closed over abandoned trenches and empty beaches, Gallipoli faded from headlines. But it did not fade from memory. It remained as a warning.
A lesson written in blood and stone.
A moment when the fate of empires shifted, not with a decisive victory, but with a devastating failure.
And history moved on.
Long after the final ships had left Gallipoli Peninsula, the conflict went on. New offensives occurred on the Western Front. Emperors fought on, tired but unmoving. Gallipoli was relegated to an unofficial footnote of history. It was a failed campaign, agreed upon, then assimilated to the larger conflict that, despite this, went on, was continuing. But for those who lived through it, Gallipoli never ended.
It followed them home.
It followed them into politics, into nations, into the nature of future wars. It followed them into how empires defined themselves and how nations defined themselves. Gallipoli was not merely the deciding factor for an empire. It changed the course history would take to judge power, sacrifice, and failure. In Britain, after Gallipoli, the atmosphere was as much concerned with unease as with anything else. There was no victory to commemorate.
No territory gained.
No clear explanation that made the loss feel necessary. Unlike battles that could be framed as heroic sacrifices for eventual triumph, Gallipoli stood alone. It had ended without redemption.
Official inquiries followed.
Committees examined decisions, timelines, intelligence failures, and command structures. Responsibility was spread thinly, diluted by complexity and political caution. No single figure carried the full weight of blame. That, too, was revealing. Gallipoli exposed a system where bold decisions were easy to make, but accountability was difficult to assign. It showed how empires could drift into catastrophe without a single dramatic error, guided instead by a series of assumptions that no one felt empowered to challenge. This realization lingered. In the years after the war, military thinkers returned to Gallipoli repeatedly.
They studied the terrain, the landings, the failures of coordination, the fatal delays,
the underestimation of defensive firepower. Amphibious warfare, once treated as an extension of naval dominance, was re-examined with new humility. Gallipoli became a case study. It influenced how future operations were planned, including those of the Second World War. The importance of unified command, overwhelming logistical preparation, intelligence accuracy, and immediate seizure of high ground became non-negotiable principles. These lessons were written in blood, and they would not be forgotten again. Not because Gallipoli was unique, but because it revealed what modern war demanded. For those who fought there, Gallipoli lived on in quieter ways. Veterans spoke of it differently than other battles. Not with pride, and not entirely with bitterness. But with a sense of disbelief, as if the campaign existed outside normal logic. They remembered the heat,
the flies, the thirst,
the feeling of being pinned in place by unseen enemies,
the endless waiting,
the knowledge that bravery alone could not change the outcome. Many carried these memories silently. Others tried to explain them to families who could not fully understand. Gallipoli became something personal, something internal. A reminder that suffering does not always produce meaning on its own. Nowhere did Gallipoli's memory take deeper root than in Australia and New Zealand. For these young nations, the campaign marked their first large-scale involvement in a global war. Their soldiers had crossed oceans to fight for an empire they still belonged to, yet did not fully define them. The losses were staggering relative to population size. Entire communities felt the absence of young men who would never return. And yet, from that grief emerged a shared story. Gallipoli became a moment of national awakening. Not because it was a victory, but because it was a trial endured together. The courage of soldiers, the endurance under impossible conditions, and the sense of sacrifice without reward all fed into a growing belief that these nations were more than distant extensions of Britain. They were something in their own right. Commemoration became central. Not triumphal, but reflective. Gallipoli was remembered not to glorify war, but to honor those who endured it. Memory became identity. For the Ottoman Empire, Gallipoli was celebrated as a rare and vital success. It proved that the empire could still defend itself against the world's strongest powers.
It restored confidence.
It unified a population that had endured decades of decline, humiliation, and loss. But victory did not save the empire. The war would grind on, and defeat elsewhere would undo what Gallipoli had preserved. Yet the campaign's impact was deeper than immediate survival. Gallipoli reshaped how the future was imagined. It demonstrated that reform, discipline, and national resolve could overcome technological and numerical disadvantages. It elevated leaders who believed that survival required radical change, not a return to old structures. From the ruins of imperial defeat, a new state would emerge. One that drew legitimacy not from dynasty or empire, but from resistance and self-determination. Gallipoli became a foundational myth, not of empire, but of nationhood. What made Gallipoli so consequential was not just that it failed. It was how it failed. The campaign exposed a gap between power and understanding, between confidence and reality, between the myths empires tell themselves and the conditions that modern war imposes. Gallipoli showed that a naval supremacy could be neutralized, a technological advantage could be offset by terrain and preparation, a political urgency could distort military judgment, and that persistence without purpose could be as deadly as defeat. These were not abstract lessons, they were warnings. Warnings that future generations would ignore at their peril. One of Gallipoli's most enduring legacies was how difficult it was for imperial systems to admit error. The refusal to withdraw early. The continuation of attacks long after success was impossible. The delay in evacuation. All reflected a deeper fear, that acknowledging failure would weaken authority. Gallipoli revealed a dangerous truth. Empires often fear embarrassment more than loss. And that fear can prolong disaster. This pattern would repeat itself in other conflicts, in other places, long after Gallipoli faded from public memory. A century later, Gallipoli remains relevant not because of what it achieved, but because of what it revealed. It revealed the cost of underestimating an enemy, the danger of believing reputation equals capability,
The human toll of decisions made far from the battlefield,
and the way failure can shape nations more deeply than victory. Gallipoli did not end an empire overnight, but it cracked the illusion that empires were permanent, rational, and infallible. Once that illusion broke, history accelerated.
On the Gallipoli Peninsula today, the land is quiet.
The ridges are green.
The beaches are calm.
The sea moves gently against the shore, indifferent to what once happened there. Cemeteries dot the hillsides, marked by simple stones bearing names, units, and dates. They tell a story without drama. Men came here believing in shortcuts. They found only endurance. They left behind a lesson no empire wanted to learn. That power without humility is fragile. That confidence without understanding is dangerous. And that failure, when ignored, reshapes the future.
Gallipoli failed.
And in doing so, it changed the fate of an empire. When the First World War finally came to an end with the armistice of November 1918, the world that came out of the wreckage hardly looked like the world that had marched off to war 4 years earlier. Empires had fallen. Borders had shifted. Millions had died. Yet, in a sense, for all the damage done, the fundamental lessons of the First World War remained to be written. Of these, perhaps the most puzzling was Gallipoli. It was not the bloodiest campaign of the war. It didn't determine the outcome of the conflict. Yet, its impact was far-reaching, far exceeding its size. Gallipoli became a warning, and the warning was repeated long after the guns had fallen silent. It was a warning about power, arrogance, and the dangers of self-delusion. For the British Empire, Gallipoli marked a turning point in how war was approached. Before 1915, there had been a lingering belief that ingenuity, prestige, and naval dominance could compensate for risk. That belief died slowly on the ridges above the Dardanelles. After Gallipoli, British strategy shifted noticeably. Planning became more centralized, intelligence gathering more cautious, logistics more heavily emphasized, and political leaders more reluctant to gamble without overwhelming advantage. This change did not come from theory.
It came from trauma.
Gallipoli had demonstrated what happened when optimism replaced preparation. That memory influenced later operations, even when its lessons were not explicitly acknowledged. When Allied forces returned to amphibious warfare on a massive scale during the Second World War, Gallipoli was studied closely. The failures of 1915 shaped the insistence on
a unified command,
overwhelming firepower, a detailed intelligence, and absolute control of logistics. The landings in Normandy in 1944 succeeded in part because Gallipoli had failed. Yet even as the British Empire adapted militarily, something deeper had shifted.
Gallipoli had pierced the illusion of inevitability.
Before the war, empire was often spoken of as permanent, almost natural. Its authority seemed self-justifying. Gallipoli revealed how fragile that authority could be when confronted by determined resistance and modern warfare. Colonial troops had fought bravely and suffered heavily. Many returned home questioning why they had been sent to die for decisions made thousands of miles away. The sense of unquestioned loyalty began to erode, replaced by a quieter, more dangerous emotion, skepticism. Gallipoli did not cause decolonization, but it weakened the psychological foundations that sustained empire. On the other side of the war, the Ottoman Empire dissolved. Defeat in 1918 brought occupation, partition, and humiliation. Allied powers carved up Ottoman territories, imposing mandates and borders that ignored local realities. It appeared briefly that Gallipoli had only delayed the inevitable. But history rarely moves in straight lines. The memory of Gallipoli became fuel. It reminded people that resistance was possible, that foreign powers were not invincible, that survival depended on reform, unity, and decisive leadership. Out of this memory emerged a new national project, one that rejected imperial decay and embraced modern statehood. Gallipoli, once a desperate defense of empire, became a foundational story of renewal. Not a celebration of war, but of endurance. One of Gallipoli's most enduring legacies lies in the tension between how states remember war and how soldiers experience it. Governments often frame campaigns in terms of objectives, alliances, and outcomes.
Soldiers remember heat, fear, confusion, hunger, and loss.
At Gallipoli, this gap was especially wide. For many veterans, the campaign never made sense. They had fought hard, obeyed orders, endured unimaginable conditions, and watched friends die, yet struggled to explain what any of it had achieved. This disconnect haunted survivors long after the war ended. Gallipoli became a symbol not of glory, but of the human cost of miscalculation. That symbolism would resurface in later conflicts, whenever leaders promised quick victories and underestimated resistance. Over time, Gallipoli accumulated layers of myth. In some narratives, it became a story of heroic sacrifice. In others, a cautionary tale of incompetence. In still others, a foundational moment of national identity. All of these interpretations contain truth, but beneath them lies a simpler reality. Gallipoli was a failure born not of cowardice or lack of bravery, but of flawed assumptions and unwillingness to adapt. The soldiers were courageous. The idea was bold. The execution was arrogant. The persistence was catastrophic.
Understanding this distinction matters.
It prevents history from becoming propaganda, and it preserves the dignity of those who suffered. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Gallipoli is how familiar it feels. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, leaders have repeatedly launched campaigns based on similar logic. The enemy is weaker than they appear. The operation will be quick. Local resistance will collapse.
Prestige will carry the day.
Again and again, these assumptions have collided with reality. Gallipoli stands as an early example of a pattern that would repeat: powerful states projecting confidence outward while misunderstanding conditions on the ground. The lesson was there. It was just inconvenient. Historians often focus on victories because victories reshape maps. But failures reshape minds. Gallipoli reshaped how nations understood themselves. It forced Britain to confront the limits of imperial power. It gave Australia and New Zealand a shared memory that defined them. It provided the Ottoman people with proof that survival through resistance was possible. And it reminded the world that modern war punishes arrogance without mercy. In this sense, Gallipoli's failure was more influential than many victories. It changed how wars were planned. It changed how nations remembered sacrifice. And it changed how the future would unfold. Today, visitors to Gallipoli walk quiet paths along ridges once torn apart by shells. The landscape is peaceful, almost gentle.
The sea glitters. The wind moves softly through grass that grew where trenches once scarred the earth.
It is difficult to imagine the chaos. But the silence carries weight. Each grave marker represents a life caught between belief and reality, between orders given and consequences endured, between imperial ambition and human limitation. Gallipoli asks a question without words. How often do powerful nations mistake confidence for wisdom? Gallipoli failed because it tried to force history to move faster than reality allowed. It assumed that empires could bend geography, morale, and human will through prestige alone. It ignored warnings because they complicated a plan that leaders wanted to believe in. In doing so, it revealed something essential about the modern world. That power must be matched by understanding. That ambition must be checked by humility. And that wars begun lightly are paid for heavily. Gallipoli did not end an empire in a single stroke, but it marked the moment when the old rules stopped working. And once that happens, the future belongs to those who adapt. By the time the world began to absorb what the First World War had truly done, Gallipoli was already slipping into a dangerous category of memory.
Not forgotten, but misunderstood.
It was remembered as tragic, costly, heroic. But rarely was it confronted as what it truly was, a moment when an empire saw its own reflection clearly and did not like what it saw. Because Gallipoli was not simply a battlefield failure.
It was a stress test.
And the results were devastating. Before Gallipoli, imperial power had a particular rhythm. Decisions were made far from consequences. Authority flowed downward.
Obedience flowed upward.
When mistakes happened, distance softened their impact. Losses were absorbed, explained away, or reframed as necessary. Gallipoli broke that rhythm. For the first time, the British Empire faced a campaign where a prestige did not intimidate, a naval power did not dominate, and colonial obedience did not guarantee success. Everything the empire believed about itself had been tested simultaneously,
and none of it held.
This realization did not cause immediate collapse. Empires rarely fall that quickly, but it planted doubt where certainty had once lived.
Doubt spreads.
In Britain, Gallipoli permanently altered how political leaders approached war. Before 1915, boldness had been equated with leadership. After Gallipoli, boldness without preparation became politically dangerous. Leaders learned that public opinion could turn sharply when sacrifice produced no result. Parliamentary oversight expanded. Military planning became more bureaucratic. Decision-making slowed, not because leaders lacked courage, but because Gallipoli had shown the cost of moving too fast on belief alone. Some critics argued this made Britain overly cautious in later years. Others argued it saved lives. Either way, Gallipoli had changed the rules. One of Gallipoli's quietest but most profound impacts was felt far from Europe. Colonial soldiers had fought loyally. They had endured brutal conditions. They had proven discipline, courage, and resilience. And yet, they had also seen how lightly their lives could be risked by distant decision-makers. When they returned home, many carried questions they had never asked before.
Why were we sent? Who decided? What was gained?
These questions did not immediately produce revolutions, but they eroded the emotional foundation of empire. Loyalty remained, but it was no longer unconditional. Gallipoli introduced the idea that imperial leadership could be wrong. Publicly, catastrophically wrong. Once that idea takes hold, it does not go away. On the other side of the conflict, the Ottoman Empire emerged from Gallipoli exhausted but transformed. The victory had proven something vital, that survival did not come from clinging to tradition, but from adapting to reality. The officers who learned this lesson most deeply would shape what came next. Gallipoli taught them. A centralized command must be balanced with initiative. A discipline must coexist with flexibility. And national survival requires unity, not imperial nostalgia. When the empire collapsed after the war, these lessons did not collapse with it. They became the foundation of something new. The state that emerged from the ruins of the Ottoman world rejected imperial identity entirely. Its founding narrative was not about ruling others, but about refusing to be ruled. Gallipoli fit perfectly into this story. It was remembered not as a defensive empire, but as proof that determination and leadership could defeat overwhelming force. This reframing mattered. It transformed Gallipoli from a defensive battle into a symbol of national rebirth, a moment when weakness was confronted and overcome through clarity and resolve. Where empires sought legitimacy through history, the new nations sought it through survival. As the 20th century progressed, war itself changed. Conflicts became larger, more ideological, more destructive. Civilian populations became targets.
Technology accelerated killing.
The distance between decision and consequence narrowed. Gallipoli stood at the edge of this transformation. It was one of the first campaigns to reveal that modern war punished assumption and rewarded preparation mercilessly. That courage without coordination led to annihilation. That technology without understanding produced catastrophe. Later wars would confirm these truths again and again. But Gallipoli revealed them early. Some battles fade into footnotes.
Gallipoli does not.
It refuses to disappear because it speaks to something universal. The danger of believing power equals wisdom. The cost of underestimating those who fight for survival. And the human toll of decisions made to preserve prestige. Gallipoli survives in memory because it is uncomfortable. It does not offer easy heroes or simple villains. It resists clean narratives. It forces uncomfortable questions about leadership, responsibility, and sacrifice. That makes it enduring. If Gallipoli teaches anything, it is this. Empires rarely fall because they are weak. They fall because they misunderstand the world they are operating in. Gallipoli exposed that misunderstanding. It showed that modern war had outgrown imperial habits. That reputation no longer frightened prepared defenders. That confidence without humility was not strength, but liability. The empire that landed at Gallipoli believed it could bend history. The one that left understood too late that history does not bend. It breaks those who refuse to adapt.
Imagine the peninsula at dawn, years after the war.
Mist hangs low over the ridges.
The sea is calm.
The beaches are empty.
No gunfire. No orders shouted.
No boats approaching shore.
Only wind, stone, and silence.
That silence is Gallipoli's final message.
Not triumph, not defeat, but consequence.
An empire came here believing it could shortcut history. History answered slowly, brutally, and without mercy. And the world that emerged afterward was never the same. History has a strange way of finishing wars long after the last shot is fired. For Gallipoli, the reckoning did not end with evacuation, inquiry, or memorials. It continued quietly, embedded in doctrines, politics, and national psychology. The campaign became something far more enduring than a failed military operation.
It became a reference point.
Whenever leaders spoke of bold moves, shortcuts, or decisive strikes, Gallipoli lingered in the background, unspoken but present. A reminder of what happens when ambition outruns understanding. Before Gallipoli, wars were often justified through confidence. Leaders spoke of inevitability,
of destiny, of swift results.
The public was expected to trust that authority knew best. After Gallipoli, that trust became conditional. Governments learned they could no longer rely solely on prestige to explain sacrifice. They had to justify strategy, preparation, and risk. When they failed to do so, skepticism followed quickly. This shift did not prevent future wars, but it changed how they were sold. Gallipoli forced leaders to speak more carefully, to plan more thoroughly, and to recognize that modern publics were less willing to accept blind faith. Within military institutions, Gallipoli became a cautionary blueprint of what not to do.
Officers studied
The dangers of divided command,
the necessity of unified operational control, the absolute importance of logistics,
and the unforgiving nature of amphibious assaults. Gallipoli taught that courage cannot compensate for chaos, and that bravery without coordination leads only to exhaustion and loss. These lessons reshaped training manuals and war colleges. They influenced how future campaigns were planned, especially when landing troops under fire. When later amphibious operations succeeded, they did so not by ignoring Gallipoli, but by remembering it. While states and militaries analyzed Gallipoli through reports and doctrine, soldiers remembered it differently. They remembered confusion. They remembered orders that made no sense. They remembered waiting under fire with nowhere to go. For many veterans, Gallipoli resisted heroic framing. It was not a story of victory snatched from defeat. It was a story of endurance without resolution. This mattered. It kept Gallipoli from becoming pure propaganda. It preserved its honesty. It ensured that remembrance focused less on triumph and more on consequence. Gallipoli became a reminder that suffering deserves truth, not embellishment. In the years that followed, Gallipoli became deeply embedded in national identity across several societies. For some, it represented the cost of loyalty to empire. For others, the birth of independent consciousness. For others still, proof that survival was possible against overwhelming odds. Each interpretation differed, but all were rooted in shared trauma. Gallipoli showed that nations are often defined not by victories, but by how they endure failure. This is why the campaign still resonates. It speaks to resilience rather than conquest. Perhaps the most unsettling legacy of Gallipoli is how often its pattern reappears. Again and again, powerful states convince themselves that the enemy is weaker than they appear. The operation will be quick. Resistance will collapse.
And history will cooperate. Again and again, reality intervenes.
Gallipoli stands as an early, clear example of this cycle. A moment when belief collided with preparation, and preparation lost. It is uncomfortable precisely because it feels familiar. After Gallipoli, the British Empire did not collapse overnight. But it never fully regained its pre-war certainty. Confidence was replaced by calculation.
Authority by scrutiny. Boldness by caution.
Some viewed this as decline. Others as maturity. But one thing was clear. The empire that landed at Gallipoli believing in shortcuts did not exist anymore. It had learned painfully that power without humility is fragile. Standing at Gallipoli today, one question lingers above all others. How many lives were lost not because the cause was unjust, but because the assumptions were wrong? This question does not accuse individual soldiers. It challenges systems. It challenges leadership. It challenges the idea that ambition excuses unpreparedness. Gallipoli asks us to examine not just history, but decision-making itself. Gallipoli failed not because the soldiers lacked courage. They had courage in abundance. It failed because leaders mistook confidence for clarity, reputation for reality, and persistence for wisdom. And in that failure, something irreversible happened. Empires learned that they were not immune to consequence. Nations learned that identity could be forged through suffering. And history learned that failure can be more transformative than victory. Gallipoli did not change the fate of an empire in a single moment. It changed how the future understood power. By the time Gallipoli had settled into history, something unexpected had happened. The battle had stopped belonging to generals. It no longer belonged to strategy papers, cabinet debates, or official histories alone. It had passed into something deeper and more enduring.
Memory. Identity. Warning.
Gallipoli became a place where the past refused to stay quiet.
Gallipoli's terrain never forgot the war. The ridges where soldiers once clawed for cover still bear scars beneath the soil. Shell fragments surface after heavy rain.
Trenches, now softened by time, still trace the contours of old front lines. Nature reclaimed the peninsula, but it did not erase it. Visitors walk paths once soaked with blood and confusion.
Guides speak softly. Silence feels appropriate.
There is an unspoken understanding that this was not a place of triumph, but of reckoning. Gallipoli does not celebrate power.
It interrogates it.
Every nation involved in Gallipoli told the story differently. For Imperial Britain, it became a cautionary chapter. A reminder of what happens when confidence outruns planning. It was studied more than celebrated, analyzed more than honored. For Australia and New Zealand, it became a story of awakening. Not because they won, but because they endured. Gallipoli gave them a shared memory distinct from Britain, forged through sacrifice rather than command. For the Ottoman people, Gallipoli became proof that survival was possible. That a state long dismissed as weak could still defend itself through discipline, leadership, and unity. Each narrative diverged, but all centered on the same truth. Gallipoli mattered not because of what it achieved, but because of what it revealed. Historians often ask why Gallipoli still commands attention when so many battles were bloodier, larger, or more decisive. The answer is simple.
Gallipoli teaches.
It teaches that wars are not won by belief alone. That confidence without intelligence is dangerous. That terrain, logistics, and morale matter as much as firepower. And that leadership is tested not when plans succeed, but when they collapse. Gallipoli offers no comfort, only clarity. In the decades that followed, some leaders absorbed Gallipoli's lessons. Others repeated its mistakes under new names. Some studied it as a warning against divided command and rushed operations. Others convinced themselves that technology or ideology would succeed where empires failed. Gallipoli's tragedy is not that it happened. It is that it keeps happening.
Different places.
Different eras.
Same assumptions.
If you strip Gallipoli of politics, strategy, and memory, what remains is the soldier's experience. Men ordered forward with incomplete information. Men holding ground with no hope of relief. Men waiting for decisions that never came. Gallipoli revealed a brutal truth of modern war. The individual endures consequences created far above him. That truth has not changed. Perhaps Gallipoli's greatest legacy is what it did to certainty. Before it, empire felt permanent.
Authority felt natural.
Superiority felt assumed. After Gallipoli, those ideas could no longer stand unchallenged.
Empires could fail. Assumptions could kill.
And belief could not replace reality. Gallipoli cracked the psychological armor of empire.
Once cracked, it never fully healed.
A century later, Gallipoli still asks questions modern societies struggle to answer. When is boldness vision, and when is it arrogance? When does persistence become denial? Who bears responsibility when plans fail but orders continue? Gallipoli offers no easy answers. It only shows the cost of asking too late. Gallipoli was meant to end a war quickly. Instead, it revealed how wars truly end, not with decisive gestures, but with long consequences that reshape nations, identities, and power itself. It failed militarily. It succeeded historically. Because in its failure, Gallipoli forced the world to confront a reality it had tried to ignore. That power without humility is fragile. That strategy without understanding is lethal. And that history does not forgive arrogance. As the sun sets over the Dardanelles, the water glows softly, unchanged by the suffering it once carried. Ships pass quietly now. The strait remains narrow. The land remains steep. But the world is different. Empires rose believing they could command history. Gallipoli showed them history answers back. And it does not speak gently. There is a moment in every great historical failure when the noise finally fades. Not the noise of battle, but the noise of justification. When excuses stop working.
When pride can no longer disguise reality.
When the story must be told honestly, or not at all. For Gallipoli, that moment came slowly, almost reluctantly. But when it arrived, it changed how the 20th century understood power itself. Many disasters in history are absorbed by victory elsewhere. They become footnotes, overshadowed by success that follows. Gallipoli had no such rescue. There was no later triumph that made it worth it. No strategic gain that justified the cost. No decisive turning point that redeemed the suffering. This mattered. Because without redemption, Gallipoli could not be simplified. It could not be turned into a clean legend of sacrifice leading to triumph. It remained unresolved.
Uncomfortable. Honest.
That honesty is why Gallipoli still endures. Before 1914, European empires believed war was something they controlled.
They believed.
A planning could outthink uncertainty. A technology could overpower geography. A prestige could substitute for preparation. And weaker states would collapse under pressure. Gallipoli destroyed that worldview. It showed that a geography could defeat fleets. Defenders could neutralize superior firepower. Morale could outweigh material advantage. And imperial confidence could become a liability. The war did not end at Gallipoli, but the illusion that war could be managed like policy did. One reason Gallipoli resonates so strongly is how contemporary it feels. The assumptions behind it are not relics of 1915. They appear again and again. It will be quick. The enemy is weaker than they look. A show of force will be enough. Backing out would look worse than pushing forward. These are not historical errors.
They are human ones.
Gallipoli endures because it exposes patterns that repeat whenever power meets overconfidence. At the center of Gallipoli's legacy is a hard truth. The people who paid the highest price had the least influence over the decisions that sent them there. Young men from farms, cities, colonies, and villages fought and died for assumptions they did not create. They endured shortages, disease, confusion, and fear while debates continued far from the battlefield. Gallipoli reminds us that strategy is never abstract. It is lived, suffered, and remembered by individuals. Remembering Gallipoli is not about honoring failure. It is about honoring truth. Truth about how wars begin. Truth about how they spiral. Truth about how difficult it is for power to admit error once blood has been spilled. Gallipoli challenges the comforting idea that good intentions excuse bad decisions. It forces us to confront the difference between courage at the front and caution at the top. That distinction matters. For the British Empire, Gallipoli was not the moment of collapse. But it was the moment innocence ended. After Gallipoli, empire could no longer pretend it was always rational, always competent, always justified.
The cracks had shown.
Others would widen them in the decades to come.
Gallipoli marked the beginning of a long reckoning. Not a dramatic fall.
But a gradual loss of unquestioned authority. For the people who defended Gallipoli, the campaign became something larger than a battle.
It became proof.
Proof that survival was possible. Proof that leadership mattered. Proof that an empire dismissed as weak could still resist. That proof shaped the future more deeply than territory ever could. Gallipoli did not save an empire, but it gave birth to a nation's confidence. If Gallipoli teaches anything, it is this. Power must be paired with humility. Strategy must respect reality. And leadership must be willing to stop when plans fail. Because persistence without purpose is not strength.
It is denial. Imagine the peninsula one last time. The sun rises over the ridges.
The sea moves gently through the strait.
Birds circle above ground once torn apart by artillery.
Nothing in the landscape demands remembrance.
And yet, everything does.
Because Gallipoli is not preserved in stone or soil alone. It lives in every moment when leaders promise certainty where none exists. In every war launched on belief rather than understanding. In every failure prolonged because pride refuses to retreat.
Gallipoli failed.
And in failing, It changed the fate of an empire. But more than that, it changed how history understands power itself. There is a final way Gallipoli must be understood.
Not as a campaign.
Not as a failure. Not even as a lesson. But as a moment when history slowed down long enough for the world to see itself clearly. Most wars come wrapped in explanations. Leaders explain why they had no choice. Why risks were necessary. Why losses were unavoidable. Over time, repetition turns these explanations into accepted truth. Gallipoli resists that process. More than a century later, it still refuses to be neatly justified. There is no sentence that makes the cost acceptable. No strategic outcome that balances the ledger.
No moral framing that redeems the suffering.
That resistance is its power. Gallipoli forces us to confront a reality that history often tries to soften. Some failures are simply failures. And pretending otherwise only guarantees repetition. At the center of Gallipoli's story are the men who never voted on the plan. They did not debate strategy. They did not weigh political consequences. They did not argue over prestige.
They followed orders.
They climbed ridges under fire. They waited for water that never came. They held ground because retreat was forbidden. They died believing someone else knew what they were doing. Gallipoli reminds us that the moral weight of war rests not on intention, but on consequence. That weight never disappears. Empires rarely announce their decline. They continue to speak in confident language. They continue to issue proclamations. They continue to act as if authority remains unquestioned. But inside, something changes.
After Gallipoli, the British Empire still commanded vast territory.
It still fielded powerful armies. It still influenced global politics. But it no longer moved with the same certainty. Every future decision carried an unspoken question. What if this becomes another Gallipoli? That hesitation mattered. It marked the beginning of an age where empire would need justification, not assumption.
Explanation, not entitlement. Consent, not inevitability.
Gallipoli did not end empire. It ended empire's innocence. On the opposite side of the strait, Gallipoli lived on differently. There, the story was not about failure, but about survival under impossible odds.
About discipline under fire.
About leadership born not from privilege, but from necessity. Gallipoli became a reminder that history does not belong only to the powerful. It belongs to those who endure. From the defense of a narrow peninsula came a confidence that reshaped a people's future. Not an empire rebuilt, but something more durable. A nation defined not by conquest, but by resistance. The reason Gallipoli still matters is not historical curiosity. It is relevance. The assumptions that drove the campaign are still with us. That force can replace understanding. That speed can compensate for preparation. That admitting failure is more dangerous than continuing it. Gallipoli shows what happens when those assumptions collide with reality. Reality always wins. There is a moment in every conflict more dangerous than the first shot. It is the moment when leaders realize they were wrong, but continue anyway. Gallipoli lived in that moment for months.
Plans failed. Assumptions collapsed. Evidence mounted.
And still, the campaign continued. Not because victory was possible, but because retreat felt unacceptable. That moment, more than any other, defines Gallipoli's legacy. It is the moment when pride outweighs judgment. Gallipoli does not offer inspiration in the traditional sense. It does not tell us that sacrifice guarantees meaning. It does not promise that courage ensures success. It does not suggest that suffering redeems bad decisions. Instead, it offers something rarer.
Honesty.
Honesty about how power misleads itself. Honesty about how war punishes illusion. Honesty about how history changes not only through victory, but through failure that cannot be ignored.
Stand on the Gallipoli Peninsula at dawn.
The strait is narrow. The hills are steep. The sea moves quietly between continents. Nothing about the land suggests inevitability.
And that is the point. Nothing about Gallipoli guaranteed disaster.
The disaster came from choices.
From assumptions.
From belief unchecked by reality. History did not trap the empire here. The empire walked in willingly.
Gallipoli failed.
It failed militarily. It failed strategically. It failed politically. But in that failure, it revealed truths that victory often hides. That power without humility collapses inward. That leadership is tested not by ambition, but by restraint. And that the cost of being wrong is paid by those least able to refuse. Gallipoli did not just change the fate of an empire. It changed how history remembers power. And that may be its most enduring legacy of all.